probably the first Zoom presentation I've done of my work, and like writing statements about your work, it's always as much about trying to hone down exactly what it's about as much as trying to make it sound fancy. So this is probably kind of some kind of voyage of discovery for me as much as hopefully it is for you. So relative to the work that's on show in Elysium now, I thought I'd maybe just look at the stuff I've been up to for the last few years, and then it all feeds into it, and it probably makes it a bit more sense. A little bit of history. I graduated from Cardiff College of Art in the early 80s. I then got involved in independent filmmaking, usually using 16mm film. I think it was just it was dealing more with like experimental narrative film, and I probably was more interested in the more formal side of it. But I think it was just such a process of delayed gratification and kind of expense and the whole mechanics of it that it wasn't the best climate for developing creatively. So I think I slowly abandoned that, and probably over the intervening years, I made quite a few false starts in painting, because I probably always reverted to painting. And then it's probably the work that I'm doing now probably seriously started about 5 years ago. And I built myself a studio. I built myself a huge studio. Well, it's a high wall studio. And I thought, I can do big pieces in here. Then I just ended up doing tiny little pieces in it. So I'm just going to show you my beginnings of this period. It was probably roughly 5 years ago. And just how I kind of probably quite ruthlessly just set about. I think my main aim was just to actually produce something. I feel like the whole process of filmmaking, there's so much laborious mechanics of it. I just wanted to actually make something very, very quickly exist in the world, and just different strategies I use myself to kind of achieve that. And obviously this is very messy beginnings. It's just kind of simple white lines, simple paint. And I think I imposed a lot of limitations on myself, a lot of restrictions. And I've got a couple of notes that I've written about the marks were determined by the tools they're using. So like if they were probably like 1/2 inch palette knife marks, I didn't particularly want to use brushes, and I thought that might lapse into being too expressive. So there's several of these, and it was basically just how to make an object exist in the world, really. And I think like the marks were just determined by the different size palette marks. And I think even though I was using these strategies to actually produce an object, I think it wasn't a strategy. It actually became, as it is today, the ongoing content of the work. And it's the work is just about making something exist in the world rather than any external meaning. These are probably works I've never shown much. Even then, there's still decisions being made about color combinations, and they're all relatively small. They're all about 6 inches, 9 inches. So that's just alternating, and it's just very, very quick. Not exercises, but just kind of endeavors. And I think it was just like, what can you do with such limited resources? And actually, this is probably one of the first successful ones. That this was actually exhibited. Again, I wasn't trying to make a textural painting. It was just kind of the amount of paint that was needed to thoroughly cover it, really. And I think I was playing about with the idea of it as an object, I think the idea of the painting as an object was always there. And these are kind of quite small things. And then I probably got a bit beyond myself, and I thought, well, I'll combine that with something more textural. And that was probably the first and last time I did that. And it became maybe too figurative. It wasn't. I think I was probably working towards something where the formula, the limitations actually determined the form of it. I think these are moving on to. I wanted to start the marks themselves, the curved marks, and then in order to emphasize the object nature of them even more, I started using shaped boards. I think I probably, on one or two attempts, I used plywood. And I think it's just the actual process of being too laborious and not getting a fine enough finish. I then very quickly started using foam board, which I've used up to the present day, actually. It's very easy to cut. It's ridiculously light. And these are very small. I think I was making two or four of these a day. They're very quick to execute. There wasn't a lot of planning. I mean, these are still the result of many rejections, but again, I was trying to steer away from anything too expressive, and it was just a matter of what if you have two bands, and then instead of, I think the shaped canvas, I think, was moving away from like a figure on the ground, so it wasn't your standard rectangular canvas or board, and just whatever formula, it was just a cross on a black indigo oval. Again, that's just the shaped, and this is probably about maybe 6-7 inches circumference. Again, always emphasizing the mechanics of it, the palette knife marks. It was just an idea of what kind of painting be. I mean, on what shouldn't it be? I mean, I could have easily put these like L shapes on a square background, and then that would have been something about a figure on the ground. I just thought, why can't the marks actually be the shape, determine the shape of the piece itself? And I think they could be seen as straying into sculpture or reliefs, but I think I've always considered them as paintings, and the limitations of paintings, the two-dimensionality of it, the edges. And then I probably did quite a lot of work where I fell into this motif of having a white border, and there probably was quite a lot done with that. And this was basically, there's a certain inevitability about it. It wasn't that I wanted these two L's. It's just like, what if I put two L shapes and I did a circumference, radius that was the same width as the bar, and then you just inevitably, by following these processes, you end up with a particular image. I think something I was going to move on to later. What if I make a comb-shaped painting? Again, this is more graphic or drawn, and it was just dictated by the palette knives and palette knife marks. And then you have things like the joins between the two, where the ends of the orange meet. There's something going on there, and it's obviously it's always the materiality of it. Obviously, you can see this is oil on board, and it's leaking the oil into the board. Again, that's just bisecting a square from corner to corner, but then there was nothing going in the top left-hand, right-hand corner, so that was just cut off, and then it becomes a figure on the ground, but it also just becomes just an object as well. I think I was just playing about with what can a painting be? It can be recessed, it can be grooves. Again, there's a lot of marks just determined by the palette knife. Again, there's just two shapes on top of each other. I was always keeping the colour, usually just one colour plus white or black per piece. And I think once I started playing about with more than one colour, there was just too much going on. And I think it was a matter of like choosing a colour to complement or not the shape. And it was sometimes, I think it was a purely intuitive decision for colour. And sometimes so-called wrong colour could completely spoil a piece. And I think it's emphasising the structure of it and the process was always the main priority, so that it was a matter of limiting the colour to usually just one piece. And these might have just like the shape of the base, just following the the logic of the geometrical shape. And it was just two diamonds, look at that. But they do increasingly start looking like logos or trademarks, which obviously is a completely accidental byproduct. It's just like, I mean, these two-letter E's just fitting in with each other. And then it's kind of, what if I have a painting with grooves? But I think it was always a matter of, it was strangely like an element of illusionism, because even I wanted to emphasize the materiality, it gives the impression, this has all been constructed, it's all been constructed from individual elements. It hasn't been kind of carved out. So what if you had a painting with a tail? Just three logical squares joined together in a triangle, but then it becomes reminiscent of a logo, which is interesting because it's kind of it's a way in of a viewer bringing other associations to it, but obviously not my intention. These are probably all maybe 4 or 5 years old. Different relief elements. It's partly for me to say what can a painting be, and I think it was a way to make this painting exist. Just once I combine a certain number of elements, it just does exist in the world, and it doesn't mean anything beyond the fact that I've made it, that I've constructed it. I think I've always, they probably do look like they do aesthetically, because I probably do have an attachment to maybe mid-century 1950s, 60s abstract work. I think it's work that kind of has a certain poetry to it, a certain lyricism to it, that doesn't necessarily refer to anything beyond itself. And these are just very simple ideas. What if I have bars coming in and the ends are curved? It's as simple as that. What if a painting is made up of 4 slabs? And then it's probably ridiculously a huge amount of mathematics and drawing out of this to end up with a fairly simple cellular-like thing, and it was just a matter of moving more and more away from the right-angled, the straight edges of the painting. Again, these are all on foam boards that they've done after the initial drawing is done. I think all the drawing is quite precise and all the measurements are exact, so that I know that when I start executing the paint, however kind of loosely that's done, there's always quite a solid structure to sustain it. I think I just kind of paint them enough to give the impression of precision, but not to be slick in any way. And this was just another idea of 4 crosses on top of each other. And obviously the bars, the width of the different colour bars are just determined by the palette knife. So this then is probably the first time I showed them. And what stands out here is probably the use of colour, which probably wasn't never an intention. It was, I think, decisions for colour was kind of quite random. And I think what's interesting is that even though each piece was conceived individually, they start working together, and it starts becoming sorry, I lost there. The colours start working together in a single piece, juxtaposing the colours. So the actual exhibiting of them is a new piece in itself, which brings on to this, because I think I had these, and I was invited to send a bunch of work to the gallery in Germany, and I probably sent about 40, 50 pieces, small pieces, all which were conceived individually. And I just thought the gallery curator was going to just select maybe 10 pieces, but she actually exhibited them all as one piece, and that was probably the first time that, and it never occurred to me. So she actually exhibited them as one piece, and it was for sale as one piece, which you probably called an installation. So that then threw up a whole new possibilities, even though, and I think, and then that then continued. I several other shows once I produced more work. It's an interesting thing, because even though each single piece was conceived totally independently, they do seem to hang together, and it's much of, but they could look awful if they were arranged wrongly. And that was in a space. So you have an idea of the scale. I mean, each piece is quite different to the next, and I think it's just the identity of each piece was lost slightly when they were all bunched together, and I think it's just a second life for them. Really, they have their own existence, and you can probably see in this shot where a lot of them, even though they do follow some kind of geometric logic, they do end up looking like pseudo trademarks or logos, which was never an intention. So yeah, I didn't actually mention. So they're all on foam board. I always use oil paint as well. So that kind of is a weird contradiction, because it's kind of quite a luxury product and on a quite a transient, disposable base. But they do seem to survive. They don't deteriorate. And this was a show I had in Arcade the end of 2020, which is probably quite similar to the previous shows, but it spaced them out, and it just kind of, so that's probably 10, 12 feet high. it was always this dilemma then, how do you exhibit these pieces individually? Because they are quite relatively small, but they do work together. So I think at this time then I was moving, and this is a shot of the first collection, which is then reinstalled in the buyer's house, which sold as one piece. But it's interesting that probably 50% of these are actually not the way I intended them. They've been rotated, but that's not my problem. And then I was moving on to, I think it was a matter of the pieces were suggesting objects in the real world, or familiar objects, everyday objects or logos. And this was a fairly quick throwaway exercise that it was a very familiar, iconic image, which is a doorbell, which is basically just several slabs of solid in color. And it was a matter of then, rather than the paintings referring to objects, it was a matter of then flipping that slightly and seeing how objects in the real world are quite graphic and possibly more two-dimensional, which then could double as abstract paintings. So I did a series of, these are just bread tags. These are probably about 6 inches square, which I then did variations of the fastenings, which is probably a dying thing now, a bread tag. So these were, I said, about like 6 inches square. So as much of then real world objects just masquerading as paintings. This was just the idea of a painting, just an extra element, just a groove. And I mean, again, these are exhibited together, but they were all conceived independently, just with a different geometric logic, just like from corner to corner. And then I started again all on foam board. It was a matter of doing some pieces that kind of referred to mass-produced objects, but also something that is very evocative of something you might find washed up on the beach, just a fragment of a mass-produced object that's lost its form or function, but I'm just kind of then not really reappropriating it, because I've then kind of painstakingly recreated these things from scratch to give the impression they've just come out of some kind of mold. Again, it's keeping the colour to a single colour. I think just kind of, I think it just gives it more strength. I think there's not too much conflict of colours within the same piece. So obviously on this piece, each of those green squares would have been kind of independently painted and stuck on and rounded, and so just to give just enough work to give the impression of some kind of precision. But then again, it's got all the tropes of a painting. It's got a certain textural quality to it. Again, not literally referring to anything. It's just a slab of something that suggests that it could have been part of something bigger with some kind of just very literal function, very practical previous life. Again, the colour is just an intuitive decision. Something that doesn't overwhelm it, something that isn't too shouty. I think all in common with most of the pieces. It's a matter of just a certain quietness, a certain stillness, and I think kind of there's always a problem using like a lot of red or whatever. A lot of colors can become quite aggressive and just detract from the form, I think. Again, certain colors might be evocative of certain vintage, so-called vintage colors, of colors outside of painting, but colors of objects in an industrial world or everyday objects. Again, there's a collection of those together. Again, they work together, and they kind of, that then produces a single whole piece, but they're all conceived individually. I think during lockdown, this is probably the middle of 2020, another departure. Again, it was the kind of intellectually playing on the idea of what constitutes a painting. A painting has to include paint on canvas, and it was just a matter of just using the canvas as the border, as a container, rather than a base that supports the pigment. So it's actually literally wrapping, bandaging up a band of colour. Again here, and there's, so the painting is wrapped in canvas. These are very small. That's probably only about 4 inches diameter. The dots were something I experimented with them in. It's probably not precise enough, and they probably the messiness of the stencil was possibly too much going on. But and then that was obviously a continuation of that, and obviously a very literal departure. But so each of those segments would have been kind of painted, then it would have been cut up into slices, and then rewrapped in canvas. So very labour intensive. Again, continuing the idea of something discarded. I think these are probably a bit too gratuitously textual, I think. I mean, these were sanded away. I think these are probably based on some kind of gingham pattern, based on a two-dimensional pattern, but making it into a 3D object. This was exhibited in Beat 2020. Again, continuing the idea of canvas, actually canvas stuck on top of foam board, and each of these elements were painstakingly made. And then that's basically just 2 slabs, but then it is also a light switch. It was the idea of everyday objects that could then double as painting, and then a collection of those together. Again, still using the canvas. I also, at the same time, thought, what would it look like if I just made so-called more conventional paintings? So these, even though these are on canvas on board, I actually people actually laboriously made canvas frames from foam board to look like cheap canvases, and then they're covered with the canvas and glued down. So these are kind of far more traditional. So it's actually just using just rectangular canvases. And I think it probably was quite limiting for me. And I think I moved away then to shaped. I think this one probably evolved from just the idea of a painting hardly hanging together and just being made up of individual slabs and just connected with the bare minimum of connectors here. And then that then probably accidentally led on to the idea of it looking like a modeling kit. So like an Airfix kit, whatever. So just again, what does constitute a painting? And I think kind of intellectually then that kind of suggested the idea of a painting being made up of component parts that you do assemble yourself. You assemble it emotionally, and there is nothing there apart from the kit and the parts. There's a few of those together. Then this was probably the biggest piece I made to date, which is probably 3 foot across. Again, it's taken an iconic design and it's just breaking it down into its constituent parts as you would a modeling kit. And this is probably all cut out of one whole piece. And it's a ridiculous amount of work compared to the quick pieces I've done. So they would actually all make up a complete Welsh blanket. Again, there's just smaller versions. I think then I moved on to the idea of, rather than just straightforward geometric formulas to determine what the painting looked like, I'd use kind of pre-designed motifs, and this was based on a crossword. So not only did I have a good graphic base to work from, which I then kind of destroyed, or whatever. I turned it was the intellectual idea of a format that has a single correct answer, it has a solution, and obviously that's not what paintings are. Paintings have many kind of readings. So I was kind of just trying to make a single meaning redundant just by representing it as a painting. This was probably maybe 12 inches square. Again, these are like negative crosswords. These are very small. And that's a very big one. Again, like that's very messy. Just that idea of not really being a solution. Again, I'm dangerously combining more than one colour there, and whether it can still kind of keep the integrity of the form. And that's another one which... So this obviously refers to, hopefully, a lot of this work then adds up to what is now on show in Elysium. And this is, again, using an iconic puzzle format and the idea of something having an answer. I mean, this actually was made as 15 individual one piece, then cut into 15 individual tiles and rearranged. So there is actually theoretically a solution to that, where if they were positioned in the right place, and then again by painting them all the same color, again it's like an intuitive soft color which kind of works. It's kind of non-aggressive. It's against the whole idea of a competition and solution. This then is based on a marble game. which again is another kind of graphic device, which has a single answer, but representing it as in the world of painting, so that it could never. I mean, I think the roots would actually work, but then it's just become so kind of nullified in the world of art that it probably wouldn't work then. Again, these are self-explanatory, but it just everyday graphic objects, which kind of, and you probably never would have a double three. A painting with holes, which is a nice idea. Noughts and crosses. And it gives you an idea of the scale and the drying procedure. I think this is moving now more towards the work in the Elysium. This was an idea of producing the work from absolutely individual elements. So these are just kind of discs that were glued together, painted beforehand and glued together to produce a whole. Similar there. Then again, I think it was probably difficult because this was possibly the first one I made, and these were individual lozenges, but it was difficult to get them even precise enough to give the impression of precision, exact enough. So probably the back of that is one piece, and the individual pieces. So it's given the impression. So there's a lot of deceit going on, really. These are probably all individual elements. Again, this is a combination of the back piece being a single grid that has been cut out, and then individual elements glued on top. So they are quite roughly painted, but because the measuring is quite precise, I think there I'm playing about with the idea of edges and shadows. So some are grey, some are black, depending on which side you view it from, which then brings to the show. And these are probably just all extensions of what we've seen before. This is, again, similar to the square one we just saw, but I thought it was huge when I was making it. Probably the biggest thing I'd ever made, but once it's in the gallery, it's relatively small. Again, whatever my intention is, they still do kind of allude to minimalist, post-minimalist work of the 60s and 70s. And I think that's just kind of a part of just the game, really. It's, they probably don't operate in the same way that the intention was for those. And that's just the board being cut out. Each one of these was cut out with scalpels. So again, there's a lot of delayed gratification for this, or whether it's just a ridiculous amount of physical work, which kind of you do have to hold your breath that it is actually going to be worthwhile in the end. Again, it's a much bigger version of the crossword. And this one has got the edges done in gold. Gold is something I've just been playing about with. Again, it kind of abdicates your responsibility for having to choose the so-called right colour, because gold refers more to an object. It's kind of a non-colour. And it was a matter of how I can sustain a bigger piece by using the the intimacy of small elements. This was probably one of the most recent ones, or the one I did nearest to the show. Probably very casually, it's called Boxing Day, because it's basically all it is using up the leftovers from each of these lozenge. The component parts are the cutouts from the large. They're the cutouts from this piece, and it's a tray randomly based on the proportions of a sardine can that's been jammed with these pieces, like precise enough, in lines enough to demonstrate the logic, some kind of logic to it, but not random enough. Not sure what I was going to say then, but it's not completely random. Again, that's a larger version of the marble maze. And I think I was kind of testing myself in some way just to see how big I could make something without it being too grandiose or pompous. Again, there's another soft colour. And even though I probably had most trouble with this, because even though it was just a way of working with maybe a couple of hundred crosses, some part did become quite aggressive. I think it became quite cage-like. And then I think I changed, there was 2 different colours on it, and I ended up just doing the whole lot the same colour. But as you say, you can see it's not symmetrical, basically, because the form is determined by the logic of just arranging staggered crosses. So this one is also playing about with edges. So viewed from this side, the edges are painted grey. I don't know if you can see that. And then viewed from that side, they're black. It's a cross, and then there's another cross perforated background as well. I like the idea of seeing through a painting. It just kind of, it just makes it less absolute. This is just probably going back to the crosses, and it was much of just starting off with what can you do with a simple element, and that was just this was just a very small thing I did, just how to turn a square across into a circle. That's very small. These were probably a relief for me, because I made these after all the bigger pieces, just before the show, and they're probably about 8 inches high. Again, each one of these, it gives you an impression of grooves or embossed, but they are each individual elements stuck on. It's probably trying to be a bit too clever, because viewed from the side, you can actually see that there is some kind of, and it just alludes to modernist 1960s brickwork. Again, this was just a very simple idea. What if you had a piece of work that had just things sticking out, basically, and then you can see that that's all it is. So it's kind of, but each one of these crosses was cut out. And then this is probably the biggest piece, which up until very close was all white, and I wanted the idea of just the texture of the individual crosses, just the texture of the light defining the sequence. But then it basically starts off a whole load of those, and then it's a matter of just kind of getting just enough impression of precision, that it hangs together, but obviously always emphasizing a looseness about it. Again, this is just another version of the pink puzzle I showed earlier. Again, it's the idea of encasing something in gold is just makes it more into an object, as all the previous pieces. It's always just emphasizing the painting as an object, but not actually sculpture. I meant to talk earlier about just the idea of emphasizing the object in this event. A lot of them do have rounded corners, and that's just a very, very simple thing. A lot of them do end up looking like 1970s design. This was another piece that was made with individual elements. It came from this piece, which was, again, just how can you make a single solid piece just from kind of quite ineffectual elements. The idea for this was, how do you make two elements in a painting hang together? Maybe just this playfulness of making them into dovetails so they can't possibly kind of escape. That's quite small. So I think I'm usually more happy with pieces that are kind of just quite a slight. I think they're very light, and they probably end up being more poetic, I think. Again, this is quite small, maybe 6 inches by a foot. This was using the cross motif plus alternating slabs, which then ends up giving the impression of a parquet flooring, which is obviously not the original intention, but it's basically just the inevitability of what happens once you combine certain elements. And this was probably a previous piece that very small, maybe 6 inches square, again with gold. And it's the idea of making these pieces quite approachable and quite portable and quite just soft, for want of a better word. It's again, that's all it is. This was probably a bit of a departure. It was just a very simple idea of a painting made up of ridges, really. And I think everything I've previously done has always had horizontal lines, because I kind of just thought that the vertical lines was quite aggressive. I just had a very simple idea, and as soon as I had the idea of the bands, it kind of reminded me of a grill on a 1960s radio I've got, and then I obviously measured why did that work, and it's basically the bars are twice the size of the gaps, so I basically just then duplicated that, and then there's you can see along the top edge there's a certain amount of chamfering, there's a certain level of detail to it, how to get it looking, give an impression of precision. And then, because the inner edges of those are painted black for each individual element, had to be painted before it was assembled. In the exhibition, in the show, this seemed to kind of get most attention for being some kind of weird optical Bridget Riley type thing, which obviously was the last thing for my mind, but it's not up to me how pieces of work are read. And that's the last of my slides. Yeah. So I'm not sure if anyone would like to say anything. Actually, I didn't realize time had flown by. If anyone had any questions.
Fantastic, really interesting.
Hi, Andre.
Hi. Right, I've been kind of busily scratching down notes and lots of blinking, post-it notes. I've got this sitting in front of me, some observations about the work. But I was also thinking about this earlier because I was talking with a group of students today about abstraction and where we are with certain painting genres and my interest in abstraction and why people might have difficulties with abstraction. And there is something to do with abstraction in your work. But if you just bear with me, some of the things I've written down, and I hope it doesn't come across as me as being they might be kind of slightly disconnected because they're all on bits of paper here. But some of the things as an observation of your work, and I thought about it for a while. It seems to me that because you say things like, there's a kind of negation of what's taking place for me. You say things like, oh, it doesn't have a meaning, not referring to anything, it's lost its function. And then you sort of talk about something being intuitive. And I'm not sure about this term intuitive. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that anything's intuitive, but that's. But there is a tension here between the nature of making something the object and it having a certain kind of relationship or what we recognize as something that might relate to something we've seen before. And you talked about minimalism from the 60s and 70s. And I think that has something to do with what the signifying of the shape in some way, that we might say that's minimal. I don't think, I think it's beyond that, because what you're also doing is the gestures incorporated into it in the way that you're creating something with the materiality of the paint. So I'm gonna slightly back off here into somewhere in the 1980s, going through the 90s. And some of the things I've written down here is that there seems to be a reordering of visual codes here that are deconstructing familiar signs and symbols that, for me, are the basis of shaping social relationships and identities. And you could look at Roland Barthes for this in terms of semiotics. Now, that's really different from the idea of modernism and the focus on form versus content. And I think this is kind of what I'm talking about the 80s in terms of postmodernism and that point of view that was created, which was a shift from that notion of the autonomous object and self-referential object or thing to what we're going through from that time to now as an integrated observation of culture as a vast collage of found material to be endlessly appropriated, deconstructed, reconstructed, regurgitated, and repositioned. And I think this is all taking place in your work, that things are shifting about. That makes more sense in the 21st century and where we are now, because we're living in an atemporal age where everything is mixed together and there's a timelessness about everything. History is just totally present all the time because of the nature of how we interact now through computers, Zoom, the computer screen, all that stuff. And I think it's about a kind of networkism within your work. So it also reminds me of Nicholas Bourriaud's little booklet on post-production. And Bourriaud considers this as a form of art that responds to the proliferating chaos of global culture in an atemporal information age. Bourriaud, stick with me, Bourriaud says, it is no longer a matter of elaborating a form on a basis of raw material, the paint or layer, whatever, the stuff that's of history, but working with objects that are already in circulation on the cultural market. So there are versions of other things. We're constantly creating versions of things. There's nothing original, basically. So there's this revisionism that's going on all the time. which is informed by other things. And Borio calls this post-production because the production's already happened in a kind of art historical sense from one canon of work to the other in terms of painting. And it's just, it fascinates me that there's a really wonderful connection in painting now, as far as I'm observing from a lot of painters, that has to do with where we are now. And it's not, this thing of like painting is dead. It's not, it's really alive because people are doing lots of really interesting stuff with it in ways that I don't think they've been doing it before. I mean, Rosalind Farham's work last week was a real case in point. All that stuff's going on the surface, and people think that they're looking at something from the 70s, and it's informed by that a lot, of course, but it's a kind of post-production of all that stuff. It's haunted by all that stuff, but it's actually actively existing in an atemporal age of where we are now. So it's like, it's kind of almost like it's proliferating beyond the painting, and I think that's what fascinates me, As a final note, not to kind of go on too much about this, there's a great catalogue from a German show I saw in 2016 called Painting 2.0. If you can get a hold of that, it's got loads of really great stuff in it about kind of gesture and spectacle, networking, stuff like that. But, there's stuff in there that kind of I identify with, and I identify with your work. And also, thinking about Rosalind Farham's work as well. I just think, I find your work endlessly fascinating, but I'm wondering also, is it for all the wrong reasons?
I think that as well of my own work. I can't, they can't claim to have the directness and the purity of works in the 1960s because we've moved on. But I think that still exists in the world. And so I'm aware of it. I can reference it, but it can only be referential to it.
But I think it's beyond referencing it. I think it's like, but as I'm saying, it's versions of versions of versions.
Yeah. Which
we're involved in. We can't go back to creating abstract expressionism. We can't go back to impressionism. There is nothing new, and yet, and that's very much part of our age. That there is nothing new. It's just this constant, regurgitation of stuff. I mean, postmodernism has never gone away. It's just endlessly proliferating itself. But I find that fascinating. And I often think about, what in terms of my own work as well, choosing to work with abstraction purposely, maybe to annoy people. Because they're always trying to figure out, like find things in it, like it looks like something. And of course, some of it does and some of it doesn't, but I don't think that's the point. And also, can you imbue it with some kind of genuine emotion, or, what's it dealing with? I mean, a lot of my work deals with certain forms of trauma associated with certain environments, but it could equally exist as something decorative on the wall, and I'm fascinated by that tension. And I see that in your work as well. I can read into it of something about some kind of post-industrial insignia or something, and then I have associations with that about, kind of social situations in relation to post-industrial landscapes.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of kind of just producing something that is just kind of straightforwardly pleasurable. I mean, because that's just such an unavoidable emotional thing. But obviously, there's a lot of other stuff that's gone into it. But it's something that can't be ignored. And it's impossible to go out your way to make something unpleasurable. Because it's always going to be entertaining on some level. So I'm playing with that kind of aspect of a painting on a wall as well.
Yeah, and that's also part, I think, of what I'm talking about. That there's so many, there's a complexity of layers going on, which is, the simplicity of it belies the nature of the complexity of the language involved here. That's, I think, what I'm getting at, and I think that complexity is part of our quotidian experience. It's daily experience that we're trying to negotiate this chaotic kind of regurgitation of culture all the time.
Mm. I mean, I'm probably more interested in that than stuff I get from a lot of painters. I'm just fascinated by kind of the casualness that we consume quite sophisticated imagery and objects in the everyday world.
Yeah,
Because that's far more rich than the world of painting. That's far more complex than the world of painting.
yeah. At the same time, it's what are we doing as artists? We're in some way drawing attention to some kind of subtlety or some element of that by isolating it somehow.
Yeah.
And drawing attention to it, not I guess that's why we're making
that's what an artist. That's
what attention to something.
That's what an artist does. It kind of frames something. It kind of narrows stuff down. It kind of represents it. Yeah.
Anyway, great talk. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I said there was a lot of broad brushstrokes there. I kind of so maybe there was kind of the wrong use of terminology sometimes, but it was just a matter of just kind of. I made a load of notes, but I didn't look at them once, kind of thing. It was just a matter of saying, I've done this, and why did I do this? And I'm still trying to come to terms with it myself, to say exactly why I think a piece works or doesn't, and whether it articulates.
Yeah, but I guess that's endless, And my experience being an artist pretty much all of my life, that discourse or conversation is just endless, I mean, what it meant last year is going to be different next year.
Exactly. You never know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know you're doing something okay.
Thank God for that.